Hi, good afternoon. By means of this short contribution, I will attempt to explore different starting points that may assist us in unsettling the dominant location of knowledge production. And as we already know, one such starting point entails unmasking the epistemic location from where we think. And this unmasking includes acknowledging that the West, or the global North, if you prefer, is but one of many different epistemic locations, and that Western knowledge is not, in fact, universally applicable. Yet, while many of us might appreciate the value of being explicit about our epistemic locations, many equally call for more empirical studies about and from the global South. But many such studies already exist, and many, if not all, have failed to usher in real transformative outcomes that challenge coloniality, racism, and capitalism. For this reason, Libby Porter, in a recent contribution to the interface section of Planning Theory and Practice, suggests that our starting point should be from a place of rage, of anger, and a refusal to remain silent about how urban planning and urban studies remain central to the ongoing looting of lands, livelihoods, and bodies. While Miguel Barber powerfully argues, as we will learn shortly, that until we can name and understand the violence of whiteness, the urban will not divest from whiteness. Tanja Roy, in the same interface section as Libby's contribution, goes as far as to suggest that our starting point should be to abolish urban planning altogether, since planning repeatedly makes peace with violence. Ananya goes on to explain that planning in many world regions continues to take place on stolen land, and as such, it is an inherently illegitimate enterprise. In sum, unmasking the epistemic location from where we think, rage and a refusal to remain silent, explicitly naming whiteness, and abolishing urban planning altogether are some of the starting points we might want to grapple with in our ongoing commitment to produce anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-patriarchal. Still, when grappling with the ontological question of what is the urban, we might also want to consider that in many Southern contexts, the urban cannot be understood to the exclusion of the rural, and that establishing urban-rural binaries is utterly unhelpful. Western thinking also tends to establish analytical binaries between theory and practice, nature and society, the mind and the body, and, as Ben Purvis will demonstrate shortly, between urban studies and urban science. Similar unhelpful binaries also exist in platform urbanism when attempting to distinguish between the parasite and the parasitized, as Jens K. Fiske and Letitia Chiappini will explain in their illuminating presentation. But let us briefly return to my claim that empirical studies about and from the global South have failed to usher in real transformative outcomes. Said differently, whiteness persists unabashed, as does silencing and planning on stolen lands. And one reason for this lack of transformative outcomes might rest squarely with the fact that many of us are still failing to heed Walter Mignolo's long-standing call for an epistemic delinking from Western categories of thought. To be clear, the philosophical lenses and research methodologies we use to collect, analyze, synthesize, and interpret our research findings remain rooted, whether knowingly or not, in Western ontoepistemologies. With this statement, I'm not suggesting that there is anything wrong with the use of ever-evolving Western philosophies and research methods. Rather, my aim here is simply to draw our attention to the fact that while we might refrain from masking our epistemic locations, many of us continue to interpret our located thinking through a global relational perspective. As a result, we unwittingly become engaged in a project of inscribing only one privileged position, while our education, whether obtained in the global north or the global south, effectively socializes us as Western thinkers. Thus, as Nobukosi Ngwenya so powerfully argued in yesterday's presentation, her starting point for dislocating dominant narratives is from a place of unlearning. In a similar vein, my starting point is to learn with, and to unlearn with, to be accountable for my words and actions, and to respect resistant texts. Almost 50 years ago, Sylvia Wynter, the Cuban-born Jamaican philosopher, defined resistant texts as texts that disrupt foregone conclusions about the urban by resisting dominant narratives in ways that are utterly foreign to Western thinkers. And she did so by using performance art as a means to resist dominant narratives. As such, resistant texts resemble a form of epistemic disobedience that produces an uncomfortable and oft unacknowledged incompetence. Yet years of training adds up to a kind of entitlement to know the text. And for most of us who are educated within Western ways of knowing, we simply cannot accept that some things will remain unknowable. In fact, we are trained and we are training others to know the text. Regardless, and above all else, resistant texts are grounded in decoloniality, which presents us with an altogether different onto-epistemological starting point. A starting point that is purposefully delinked and distinctly different from Western systems of thought. We therefore cannot embrace the Frankfurt School, post-structuralism, critical feminism, or any other Western framework if we are serious about adopting decoloniality as a means to produce knowledge. And what I appreciate most about decoloniality is its ability to distance itself from engaging in a war of words. Let me explain. The prerogative to discard, falsify, debunk, or to decide between competing normative narratives is a distinctly Western approach to academic work that decoloniality distances itself from. Instead, decoloniality affirms pluriversal, as opposed to universal, ways of knowing, and in doing so, it appreciates all modes of knowledge production. But this intellectual generosity remains so utterly foreign in Western ways of knowing and doing, thereby allowing critics of decoloniality to relegate it to a realm of epistemic relativism. Yet what these critics refuse to grasp is that because decoloniality is explicitly delinked from Western systems of thought, it cannot be assessed against epistemic relativism or any other Western mode of analysis. Still, the difficulty for those of us who embrace decoloniality remains the totalizing impact of Western knowledge claims. Decoloniality is thus deemed to be so utterly foreign that its philosophical values remain in doubt by Western scholars. But let me pose a somewhat provocative question. Why should it matter if decoloniality is debunked or discarded by Western scholars? Why on earth should we care what they think? After all, the adoption of Western categories of thought, including the production of countless empirical studies grounded in Western methodologies, have failed to yield real transformative outcomes in Southern contexts. Surely now is the time to reignite Southern knowledges, or be they utterly foreign to the Western gaze. To conclude, if we hope to challenge coloniality, racism, capitalism, perhaps the most salient lesson learned during the past 2 days is that our starting points might all need to be different, and that collectively these different starting points might ignite the necessary groundswell for real transformative outcomes. I would like to thank all the presenters for this learning opportunity, including Ben, Jens, Letitia, and Miguel, who will be presenting their insightful arguments and papers shortly. Thank you.